All right, let's talk about ancient superweapons. But for a minute, I want you to forget everything you think you know. We're about to take a deep dive into a myth that stood for centuries, the story of the Sassanian war elephant. And trust me, the reality is way more interesting than the legend.
When you picture the ultimate weapon of the ancient world, what comes to mind? Is it the disciplined, shield-locked power of a Roman legion? Maybe the bristling spear wall of a Greek phalanx? I mean, these are the heavyweights, the titans of ancient warfare. But for pure, jaw-dropping shock and awe, there's one image that just towers above them all: the war elephant.
And for good reason. The war elephant has this almost mythical reputation, you know? It's the original main battle tank, this colossal force of nature that could, supposedly, turn the entire tide of a battle all by itself.
This is the image that's just seared into our minds, isn't it? We see it in movies, we read it in epic stories, these living battering rams just crashing through enemy lines, scattering soldiers like bowling pins, the trumpeting calls striking absolute terror into the hearts of even the toughest veterans.
And look, this image isn't just pure fantasy. It's grounded in some very famous historical moments. As historian Michael Charles points out, Hannibal and the Carthaginians definitely used their elephants exactly like this against the Romans. So yeah, this is the model we all have in our heads, and it makes sense. But here's the puzzle. Here's where it gets really interesting. The Sassanian Persian Empire, which came much later and was famous for its massive elephant corps, doesn't seem to have used them that way at all. They had bigger, more powerful Indian elephants, yet their tactics were completely different. So what was going on? Okay, let's start with siege warfare. This was a Sassanian specialty. You'd think an elephant would be the perfect tool for, smashing down a gate. Well, the problem is, an elephant is a very, very big target. It was incredibly vulnerable to archers and all sorts of siege engines up on the city walls.
And the Sassanians, they knew this. Michael Charles tells us that the sources are pretty clear. The beasts had, and I quote, scant efficacy in these situations. Sending an elephant against a fortified wall was basically sending a very expensive, very intelligent animal on a suicide mission.
All right, fine. So not for sieges, but surely out on the open battlefield, in those massive, decisive clashes, this is where the elephant tank was finally unleashed, right? This is where they charged head-on into the enemy infantry.
You would think so, but the reality is just startlingly different. I mean, this comparison really says it all. On the left, you've got what we'd expect, that Carthaginian model of a frontal assault. But on the right, that's what our most reliable sources say the Sassanians actually did. Instead of leading the charge, their elephants were often held back in reserve, sometimes way in the back with the baggage train. They rarely even got into the fight. They just weren't being used as the tip of the spear.
So if they weren't used in sieges, and they weren't used for frontal assaults, what were they for? Well, the Sassanians had a very specific, very clever, and frankly terrifying way to use their elephants in combat. It was all about the element of surprise.
Here's the tactic broken down. The Persians would hide their elephants and their elite armored cavalry, the cataphracts. They just wait for an enemy army, maybe a Roman column, to march past or set up camp, completely oblivious to the danger. And then, bam! A coordinated surprise attack from the side or the rear, combining the shock of a cavalry charge with the sheer terror of giant elephants appearing out of nowhere.
Now, this was not a tactic you'd ever see in the Punic Wars. It was, as one historian called it, a purely Eastern phenomenon. It came from a totally different military tradition, one that valued the psychological gut punch of a sudden, shocking ambush over a straightforward head-on slugging match.
But this brings us to an even bigger question. If the elephant's main combat role was so specific, so situational, why did the Sassanian kings keep such a large and expensive corps around? The answer tells us that for the Sassanians, the elephant was so much more than just a weapon.
To understand this, we need to go back in time, way back, to one of the most famous battles in all of history. Take a look at this number, 15. This is the number of elephants that the earlier Persian king, Darius III, had with him at the legendary Battle of Gaugamela against Alexander the Great. So what did those 15 elephants do in one of the most important battles in history? Absolutely nothing. They weren't in the battle line at all. The sources say they simply accompanied the king. They were there as part of his entourage, a living, breathing symbol of his power and his reach. And that set a really powerful precedent. And that's the absolute key to all of this. The Sassanian ruler wasn't just a king. He was the king of kings. They saw themselves as the direct heirs to that ancient Persian glory. So the elephant core became this tangible, walking, trumpeting display of that royal power and tradition. It was a message to everyone in their huge multicultural empire. Look upon my majesty. Look upon the power I command.
So we have this complex reality, right? Elephants used for specific surprise attacks and as giant symbols of royal power. So how did we get from that to the myth of the unstoppable Persian elephant tank? Well, it turns out that sometimes history is shaped by the power of a really, really good story. To understand this, we need to get familiar with a key concept, a topos. Now think of it like a kind of narrative shortcut or a trope. It's a recurring theme or image that ancient and medieval historians used to add drama or to emphasize a point, whether it was 100% accurate or not.
And the war elephant became a classic topos. Later Arab historians, writing about their conquest of the Sassanian Empire, used the idea of the war elephant to make their stories better. Mentioning elephants made a battle sound way more important. It glorified their own ancestors. I mean, look at the terrifying beasts they managed to overcome. And it became this powerful shorthand for the incredible might of the old Persian world that they had just conquered. The story simply became more important than the reality.
So our image of the Sassanian war elephant is less about Sassanian military strategy and more about the narrative choices of later historians, which it leaves us with a final fascinating question to think about. How many other facts that we take for granted from history aren't really facts at all, but are just powerful stories that have been told and retold simply because they serve a purpose?